Imagine you're a mother just trying to give your child a better life. You move to a new town, a fresh start, a home full of hope. But then you begin to notice strange things. Your child's skin is breaking out, the energy draining away, and you have no idea why. Then one day, you realise the water you've been drinking, the water you've trusted to keep your family safe, is poisoning your child, and no one will believe you. This is Red Rum, a series of unfortunate events. I upload on Mondays and Thursdays, so make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. It was supposed to be a fresh start. Shannon and her son Isaiah had just moved into a small house in Flint, Michigan, looking forward to a new chapter in their lives. Shannon worked as a medical assistant at the McLaren Flint Health Centre, a prominent clinic that served the local community. It was a fast-paced environment, and Shannon was responsible for a variety of tasks, everything from taking vital signs and preparing patients for their appointments to helping doctors with medical procedures and generally just kind of maintaining patient records. She was really well liked by both her colleagues and the patients. People described her as being warm and empathetic, and that is really why the patients liked her so much. The clinic was a vital part of Flint's healthcare system because it offered healthcare to many of the city's lower income residents. Shannon often found herself working with families just like hers, hardworking, trying to make ends meet, and doing everything they could to stay healthy despite the challenges they faced. She prided herself on being a steady hand for those who came through the door, always offering encouragement and a listening ear. Shannon had big dreams for her son Isaiah. She saw his future filled with possibilities, opportunity and joy, everything I imagine any mother or parent would want for their child, but this is Red Rum, so we know that things don't happen the way Shannon had hoped. In fact, it couldn't have been more opposite. It started with something small, something that most people would overlook. Isaiah's skin, once clear and healthy, began to break out in rashes. At first, Shannon thought it was just a passing issue, maybe an allergic reaction to something new in their home. After all, kids go through phases with their skin. A little rash here or there wasn't unusual. Maybe it was a reaction to a detergent or the dry from the air or the cold weather. But then, the rashes didn't go away. They got worse. They spread across his arms and chest. His once vibrant energy began to fade, and it was replaced with what she described as sluggishness that she hadn't seen before. Isaiah started sleeping more. He'd come home from school at the end of the day and he was completely drained. He was barely able to keep his eyes open during dinner. And although this was probably concerning, it wasn't necessarily alarming to Shannon. As is normal in these kinds of situations, she probably tried to shrug it off, to quieten the voice in her head telling her to start panicking. I remember when I was about 13, I moved schools and I was really struggling to get settled. I just kind of put it down to feeling drained and tired from the change, but then I did eventually go to the doctors and they found out I had shingles. Shingles is this painful condition that usually only affects older people. It's not that normal to get it when you're younger, and my mum definitely shrugged it off to begin with. So did I, of course you do. I mean, shingles really wasn't that bad for me, but you never actually think it's going to be something long-term or really, really bad. You just excuse it. But for Isaiah, this wasn't just going away. So he had that constant fatigue and tiredness, and then he started complaining to his mum that he had pretty persistent headaches, sharp, pulsing pains that would stop him mid-conversation, forcing him to close his eyes and rub the sides of his head. Shannon thought it might be stress from school or growing pains, but she couldn't shake the feeling that maybe it was something more serious. Soon after that, he began to get quite bad stomach pains, random sudden bouts of nausea and cramping, and these would leave him doubled over in discomfort. He even started losing weight, and every day that went by, he became less built up, less athletic. And that is where he sat naturally. His frame was not used to being this thin, and he was eating the same as he always would, so it just didn't make sense. Shannon noticed that he was not himself. He was moody, he was easily irritated, and he'd snap at her over really little things. He even started withdrawing from his friends, and he stopped going to basketball practice, something he used to love. It wasn't just his behaviour that changed. His joints began to ache, especially his knees and elbows, and it meant he had to sort of sit out of gym class. He just wasn't able to be the active, athletic boy he'd always been before recently. Shannon started keeping a closer eye on him. She was really worried about how quickly everything seemed to be getting worse. And then, one evening, Shannon was filling a pot of water to make dinner. As the water poured from the tap, a faint metallic smell hit her nose. She paused, sniffing the air. Now, it wasn't overpowering, but it definitely was there. It was faint but unmistakable, like rust with a hint of something chemical. But at that first smell, she just dismissed it, thinking that it was the pipes, just a one-off. But as the days passed, the smell seemed to grow stronger, and it wasn't just the smell. There was something off about the water itself. It looked clear, but it had an odd, slick feel when she rinsed her hands under it. Even Isaiah had noticed, and he'd started to complain about how weird it tasted. Over the next few days, Shannon started paying closer attention. She noticed that the water sometimes came with a cloudy tint before clearing up. It had this odd taste too, subtle but unsettling. She asked her neighbours if they'd noticed anything unusual, and to her surprise, several of them said that yes, they had. One elderly woman, Joan McCann, mentioned that her sink had been staining with a strange orange residue, and another neighbour confessed that her kids had also been complaining of unexplained rashes and stomach issues. It was at the clinic where she worked that a co-worker of Shannon's mentioned seeing an article about the Flint River, how it had been switched as the city's primary water source just a year earlier. The water from the river was known to be heavily polluted, but of course, everyone just assumed that when it had been switched, it would have been properly treated. That night though, Shannon stayed up late, researching everything she could about the Flint River water contamination. The deeper she dove, the more horrifying the truth became. Reports about lead leaching from aging pipes, complaints from residents, and warnings from experts that had not been listened to. It was extremely clear to Shannon. The water was poisoning her son. That was like a light bulb moment for Shannon. Now it all made sense. The rashes, the fatigue, the aching joints, even the behavioural changes. It was lead poisoning. Shannon was desperate for answers, so she took Isaiah to get his blood tested the very next day. When the results came back, her worst fears were confirmed. Isaiah's blood showed dangerously high levels of lead, levels that could cause permanent damage to his body and his brain. Shannon was understandably furious. The fact she trusted that the city would provide safe water for her and her son to drink and to bathe in, but beyond that, she felt guilty she'd let this happen to her son. Obviously, she never could have known. Why would she ever have suspected that the water would be the source of his illness? The more research she did, the more she found out. But she had to do this for herself, by the way. None of the officials were working on the understanding that anything was wrong at this point, so she really didn't have any support, at least officially. But she and Isaiah weren't alone. Obviously, all of their neighbours and friends who lived nearby had also been using the water, so they had been experiencing similar symptoms. It turned out that in April 2014, the city of Flint switched its water supply from the reliable Detroit system to the Flint River as a cost-saving measure. The river, that was heavily polluted and untreated, began flowing into homes across the city. The water was not properly treated, and the pipes began to corrode, leaching lead into the supply. Lead is a really powerful neurotoxin, and residents were unknowingly exposed to toxic levels of lead. It's generally very dangerous, but especially so for children. Lead exposure in young children can cause developmental delays, lower IQ, and learning disabilities, issues that are irreversible. The long-term health effects were devastating. Shannon tried to stay hopeful. She tried to hold on to the belief that things would get better, but the government had failed them. Despite early warnings from scientists, doctors, and local residents about the dangers of the water, government officials ignored the concerns. Even when people started to notice strange symptoms and children's health was deteriorating, state officials downplayed the issue. In 2015, after Dr. Moana Hanna-Attisha, a paediatrician from Flint, conducted her own research, she revealed that blood tests showed high levels of lead in local children. It was only then that the crisis began to receive national attention, but by that time, the damage was done. Even after Dr. Hanna-Attisha's revelations, state officials were slow to act, and the water continued to flow into Flint homes untreated and contaminated. Then, in 2015, things took a horrifying turn. Isaiah developed symptoms that no mother should ever have to see. He became incredibly weak, running a high fever and coughing uncontrollably. Shannon rushed him to hospital and the doctors confirmed what Shannon had feared. Despite the attempts to stop the lead poisoning, it had already taken its hold. Isaiah had contracted Legionnaire's disease, an outbreak linked directly to the contaminated water in Flint. Legionnaire's disease is a severe form of pneumonia caused by Legionella bacteria. This thrives in water systems that aren't properly treated. That bacteria spreads through airborne water droplets from showers or faucets, so not through drinking the water, but still, the effects are equally devastating. Despite the doctor's best efforts, Isaiah's condition worsened and worsened, and eventually, he passed away just days after being admitted to the hospital. He was the victim of a failing system that had turned a blind eye to the warning signs and neglected the needs of its most vulnerable citizens. Isaiah's death was a blow that rocked Flint. By the time the crisis was fully acknowledged, at least 12 people had died from Legionnaire's disease, and more than 9,000 children had been exposed to lead in their water. The outbreaks of Legionnaire's disease was a direct result from the contaminated water supply, and the effects would ripple through the community for years to come. Shannon, of course, absolutely devastated by her loss, became a fierce advocate for justice. Her voice joined the voices of countless other families who had been affected by the contaminated water. Together they fought for accountability. They demanded that those responsible for the crisis be held to account, that the government take responsibility for its failure to protect its citizens, and they pushed for changes that would ensure no other family would have to suffer like they had. In 2016, after years of inaction, the state of Michigan declared a state of emergency in Flint, but it was way too late. The damage had already been done. The public outcry led to investigations, lawsuits, and eventually the resignation of several key officials. In 2017, the Flint Water Task Force concluded that systematic failures were to blame for the crisis, and reforms were promised, but they came too late for the thousands of people that had been affected. Isaiah's story is not just a tragedy, it's a testament to the power of fighting for the truth, even when the system tries to silence you. And it's a painful reminder that when the government fails to act, lives are not just affected, they are destroyed. The second and final case I have for you today happened to a boy called Michael Day, who was from Markham, a small town nestled just north of Toronto. Back in the 1980s, which is when this case takes place, Markham was a quiet suburban community where families enjoyed peaceful streets and a close-knit atmosphere. Back then, it was still a place where the neighbours knew each other by name, and the hustle and bustle of the big city felt worlds away. But for Michael and his family, this seemingly tranquil town would soon become the backdrop for a tragedy that would shake their world forever. It was 1984 when Michael was diagnosed with hemophilia. It's a rare genetic disorder that prevents the blood from clotting properly. For his parents, Linda and Robert, this news hit them hard, as it would for any parent. Michael was their world and they were new parents. They'd known from early on that They wanted a family of their own, so when Linda got pregnant with their first child, they began imagining what parenthood would be like and getting excited for it. They kitted out the new nursery, they told all their family and friends, and then, on the 2nd of October 1976, Linda gave birth to their son Michael. The new parents were just beginning to understand the joys and fears of raising a child when Michael was diagnosed with hemophilia. What this meant was that their child was someone who, without constant care, could face life-threatening bleeding episodes. Hemophilia meant that a simple scrape or bump could be disastrous. Bruising would appear from nowhere, and a bump that should have been a minor inconvenience could result in bleeding that didn't stop. And the most terrifying part, spontaneous bleeding could strike at any time, deep within his joints or even in his brain, and that bleeding could kill him without warning. I don't have kids, so I don't know, but I worry about my very safe, very in the house at all times unless I'm with him, dog. So for Linda, who was described as being an extremely attentive mother, she made sure to watch her son like a hawk. Every moment, every laugh, every step was laced with the awareness that the world could suddenly shift. One wrong move and Michael could be in danger. Robert worked long hours as an electrician. He was trying to provide for his family whilst struggling with his own fears. But both parents did everything in their power to shield Michael from the reality of his condition, hoping for the best, but preparing for the worst. Despite these constant worries, Michael's early years were filled with moments of joy. With the right treatment, which in this case were regular blood transfusions, he was able to play with his friends, ride his bike, and run around the back garden without too much concern. One of the most frequently reported moments from Michael's early life was the day that he learned to ride a bike without stabilisers or training wheels, an event that stood out in the memories of Linda and Robert. It was 1983 and Michael was 7 years old at the time. Robert had been determined to help his son experience as many typical childhood milestones as possible. According to Linda, Robert had spent weeks working with Michael in the front yard, carefully holding the back of the bike whilst guiding him to balance. Michael was initially hesitant, knowing that even a small fall could result in bleeding that could take him days to heal. But Robert was patient, encouraging him to try again after each and every wobble. On that particular day, the sun was bright, the conditions were perfect for a breakthrough, and after several attempts, Michael finally managed to balance on his own. Robert let go of the bike, and for the first time, Michael rode down the driveway unaided. Linda would later speak about watching from the porch, quote, "It felt like a victory, a moment of pure joy like any other family would have. For a brief moment, hemophilia wasn't at the forefront of our minds. It was just him on his bike, feeling like a normal kid." His parents clung to these fleeting moments of normalcy, grateful for the life they could give him. Michael was their world. Now, as part of his ongoing treatment, something I mentioned earlier was that he would have these regular blood transfusions. They were a critical part of his treatment plan, and they were supposed to give Michael a better shot at life. Very basically put, these transfusions would typically involve receiving clotting factor concentrates. These transfusions would help to prevent bleeding episodes, and they would also treat any active bleeding. That would mean that Michael's blood had enough clotting factor to minimise the risks of bleeding episodes and basically let him live his life more freely despite his condition. And he'd get these transfusions maybe once or twice a week. What Linda and Robert didn't know was that these transfusions, meant to save their son, would be the very thing that betrayed them. The Canadian health system was, at the time, struggling to meet demand for blood, so they imported products from paid donors, including high-risk populations like drug users who used syringes or sex workers who were at higher risk of STIs. They would import these bloods, but they would not properly test it for HIV. Obviously, the people receiving the blood, including Michael and, well, his parents, they were assured that the blood was safe. But behind closed doors, health authorities were failing to act on mounting evidence that HIV could be transmitted through blood. When the first cases of AIDS were reported, well, it obviously wasn't called that at first, but when those first cases were reported, the virus that caused AIDS, what we now know as HIV, hadn't been discovered yet. People in the medical community didn't understand how it was transmitted. Health authorities initially thought it was disease linked to specific behaviours of groups. And that misunderstanding would turn out to be deadly. The social stigma affected how seriously the epidemic was taken. We know now how badly that discrimination shaped the response and the tragedies that came out of it, but of course back then, no one knew what was about to happen. And for Michael's case, this is really important because the health authorities didn't consider blood transfusions a major risk factor at first. As the years went on, Michael's health started to decline. It was gradual at first. A cough that wouldn't go away, a sudden fatigue that left him exhausted after the smallest exertion. But then there were the bruises that just wouldn't heal, as well as mysterious aches that kept him awake at night. It wasn't until one particularly harrowing hospital visit that the unthinkable happened. Michael was diagnosed with HIV. It wasn't until one seemingly random hospital visit that Michael was diagnosed with HIV. Michael was just a teenager when he got this diagnosis, but it wasn't just HIV. Michael's transfusions had also exposed him to hepatitis C, another deadly virus that would complicate his fight for survival. Robert didn't know what he could do, but he felt he had to do something. He threw himself into action, researching HIV and hepatitis C, searching for answers, hoping for a miracle. But they weren't having any luck. And they weren't the only ones. Michael's story wasn't an isolated tragedy. He was part of a much larger epidemic. Thousands of Canadians, mostly hemophiliacs like Michael, were unknowingly exposed to the deadly HIV virus through tainted blood products. And it wasn't just the children. Families were shattered as the epidemic spread through their communities. Linda and Robert weren't just fighting for their son's life, they were fighting for all of them. For justice, for accountability, for the truth to come out. But the Canadian government and health authorities, despite mounting evidence, they failed to take swift action. They continued to use the contaminated blood long after they knew the risks. The health system had failed them and the betrayal was deep. The Creever Commission, set up to investigate the scandal years later, would reveal the full extent of the damage. How the Canadian Red Cross and other agencies had knowingly distributed contaminated blood. But for Linda and Robert, and for Michael, the damage was done. And it wasn't just the physical toll of HIV and hepatitis C, it was the emotional devastation of realising that the very people they had trusted with their son's life had failed them. Michael, now in his teens, began to watch people he'd met, now his friends, his fellow hemophiliacs, fall ill, one by one, from the same contaminated blood that had been given to them as children. The virus ravaged their bodies, and the loss of his friends was as painful as the virus itself. Linda and Robert fought alongside their son, pushing for recognition and compensation, but it was a battle that dragged on for years. Many victims never received what they were owed, and the pain of betrayal never left Michael, his parents, or the countless other families who had been torn apart by this scandal. In the end, Michael did survive. He's still alive today, but his survival came at a great cost. Linda and Robert were not just passive victims of a tragic medical failure, they became vocal advocates in the fight for justice. Together with other families affected by the tainted blood scandal, they led a campaign against the Canadian Red Cross and the government. They demanded accountability, financial compensation, basically wanted to out them, to let everyone know what had happened. Their fight brought to light the horrifying reality of what had occurred. As many as 1,000 Canadians were infected with HIV from contaminated blood products, and 2,000 more were infected with hepatitis C. Many would go on to die from AIDS-related complications, and the legacy of suffering left by this scandal was just immeasurable. The public outrage grew as the extent of the scandal was revealed. Investigations showed that the health officials had been warned as early as 1982 about the risks of HIV. But the Canadian Red Cross continued to accept blood from high-risk donors until 1985. The issue wasn't just one of oversight, it was a systemic failure that put thousands of lives in jeopardy. In 1997, a lawsuit was filed by people who had suffered and their families, demanding justice for the lives lost and forever changed by the contaminated blood. The Canadian government settled the case in 1999, agreeing to compensate victims with $1 billion in damage, the largest settlement in Canadian legal history at the time. In the end, the real blame lay not just with the individuals who failed to act, but with a system that prioritised protocol over human lives. And the lesson is clear. When the stakes are the health and safety of individuals, no excuse is ever enough to justify inaction, and accountability must always come before complacency. Thank you for listening to this episode of Red Rum. I appreciate you being here. I will see you on Monday for another episode of Red Rum. Bye.